Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Barbara Kyle, and I'm speaking to you from Ontario, Canada, from a small city called Guelph. In this webinar, I'm going to be telling you about the three things that agents and publishers want to see, really need to see, in the first 30 pages of your book, your manuscript. And it's going to take us about half an hour. Thank you very much for joining me right on time. I appreciate that. But I know that there are a lot of people joining in from many different places and different time zones. So I'm going to give it just a minute to let everybody join in here and get settled. Before we do get started, I'd love to know just a little bit about you. Could you tell me where you're joining in from? Do you see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen? If you click that Q&A box, then you will be able to type in anything. And what I'd like you to do is just type in where you are, where you're joining in from. It'll be great for me to see that. Okay, I can see a lot of people are telling me where they are. We have Mark in Dallas, Texas. Catherine is in West Covina, California. Dale in Odessa, Florida. Cynthia's in Palm Springs, California. Laura in Chilliwack, BC. BC is where my husband's from. James is in Woodbridge, Virginia. Theodore is in Woodstock, Georgia. Anne in Victoria, British Columbia. Stella in Montreal. Catherine in Cleveland, Ohio. Oh, this is great. We have people in Wisconsin, New York, Washington, California. Lots of folks in California. It's a big state. Colorado, Minnesota. Thank you very much. I can see that you're all letting me know, and it's wonderful to see. It looks like we have people from right across the continent. And I know that just from the registrations, there have also been people who registered from the United Kingdom and Spain and Germany. So it's just great to see you all here. Thank you for letting me know. I'll close that box right now. Good. I will take your questions, but I will take them at the end of this session. As I say, the webinar is going to be about half an hour, and I'll take your questions at the end of it. But please feel free to type in your questions at any time into that Q&A box. Sometimes it's good to type a question while you're thinking of it, so maybe you don't forget it. And then, as I say, when I'm finished my talk for this webinar, then I'll have a look at your questions. Okay, so let's get started with the three things that agents and publishers need to see in the first 30 pages of your manuscript. Let me make one thing absolutely clear, first of all. There are no rules in writing, okay? Every rule that has ever been proposed has been broken by some writer somewhere to very good effect. So there are no rules in writing, but there are principles that have shaped the art of storytelling for centuries. And so it behooves us as writers to be aware of these principles so that we can use them strategically to make our stories really compelling. You know, a rule says you must do this, but a principle says this works, and it has worked through all of remembered time. So as I say, it's good for us writers to understand these principles, and these are what I love to teach also. Years ago, many years ago, when I was just starting to write seriously, my mentor was Marian Fowler, author Marian Fowler. And she used to say, there is only one rule in writing: thou shalt not bore. Good advice. Marian was the writer in residence at the small library in the rural community where I used to live then. And she's the one who got me started really on my writing career by critiquing my very first short story. It was pretty bad at first, that story, but with Marian's help, I rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it, just as I'm sure you're doing with your work right now. And finally, it was in good shape, and it actually went on to win a contest, which made me very happy. And since then, as I say, that was years ago, but since then I've had 10 novels published by major publishers in New York, and over 500,000 copies of my books have been sold around the world. But it all started with that first short story. And I'm so grateful to Marion for opening my eyes to what was possible and what was necessary as far as learning about writing. I think every writer needs a mentor. And that's why I really enjoy, why I really like, as they say, paying it forward, just as Marion was doing with me. Okay, let's have a look now at the 3 crucial elements that need to be in your book's first 30 pages. I'm going to right now just share my screen with you. If I can get the right button here. Has that worked? I hope you're seeing that. If not, I'm just going to move that dialog box down. Okay, so there's only one rule in writing, as I say, thou shalt not bore, and that's a good one for us to remember. The 3 things that agents and publishers need to see in your first 30 pages. And here they are. This is what we're going to talk about today. Number 1, a clear, inciting incident. Number 2, a main character we care about. And number 3, mastery of effective dialogue. I'll be talking in detail about these today. Let me tell you, just spend a moment to tell you why I call these the 3 crucial things that agents and publishers need to see. It's because agents and publishers are inundated with manuscripts. They read manuscripts all day long and into the evening and on weekends too. And so they want a story. They need to have a story captivate them immediately. And if it doesn't really do that in the first 30 pages or so, they may just stop reading. I don't want that to happen to you. So let's start now with the inciting incident. There is a Bruce Springsteen song called Dancing in the Dark. And it has this lyric, you can't start a fire without a spark. In any novel, there must be an event that sparks your story to life. This is called the inciting incident. I chose this lovely image because I think it gives a wonderful sense of the feeling of anticipation at the start of a story. This character, might have experienced the story's inciting incident already, and she's starting on her journey, or perhaps she's just about to experience the inciting incident. Knowing where to start your story is vital, but it's also difficult. And many new writers begin with paragraphs, sometimes, pages actually, of description about the characters, description about the setting, or they start with big chunks of backstory. Backstory is the main events in a character's life before the main story gets rolling. A book's opening is not the place for backstory. And here's why. Readers cannot feel involved with a character until they see them in action. When I say in action, let me just check about what's happening here on my screen. So I'm just going to take a moment here because I have a feeling you're maybe not seeing these images. I hope you can still hear me. I'm just going to start this again and see what happens. Well, I'm not sure that has happened. I'm so sorry. I was just got confused there with my own screen. Let me go back to sharing my screen if I can. If I can't, if I screw this up again, then I will just go on with my talk, which is the most important thing. Let me see if I can do this. I'm just having a little difficulty with this sharing screen. Sorry about all this. I think I'm just going to, again, put that down. I think I'll just go on with my talk here because I'm not sure what's happening with my screen. I was telling you about the inciting incident. Readers need to care about a character right away. And that's why just description or backstory is not the best place to have to start your story. Sorry about all that. So whether you're writing a mystery or a romance or a thriller or sci-fi or YA, whatever you're writing, you want to start your story with an event in which the reader can feel engaged and really care about what's happening to your main character. And that means starting with when something is already at stake for your main character. It doesn't have to be, a world hanging in the balance stakes, but it does have to seem like that to the character. For example, the opening page, the opening paragraph of Maeve Binchy's novel, Scarlet Feather, introduces the main character, Kathy Scarlet. She has just opened her catering business, and she desperately wants to make a success of it. So on page 1, she is on her way to cater the New Year's Eve party for her mother-in-law, who is very wealthy, very powerful, and who does not approve of Kathy. So she looks down on Kathy because Kathy is the daughter of her maid. So Kathy is well aware of what she is up against with her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law's antagonism can really break her and certainly destroy her fledgling business. So success this night is vital to Kathy, and that's on page 1. Right away, we know that Kathy is involved in something that she cares deeply about, and therefore we care because we want to know what's going to happen. The point is, as I say, right away, the character is engaged in something that matters to them. And then once you've established that, then the inciting incident can occur. I like the phrase inciting incident because it suggests that necessary spark that starts a story. An event occurs that incites the character to take some kind of action. That's why the phrase inciting incident is so helpful. Because that word incite implies action, a writer can't, as writers, we can't fool ourselves that description or backstory constitute an inciting incident. They do not. So what does make an inciting incident? Well, here's a definition. The inciting incident is the event that throws your main character's world out of balance. The inciting incident is the event that throws your main character's world out of balance. So what that character does to try to regain balance in their life forms the story. A person's life can be, of course, horribly upset by a murder or a call to war or by getting fired. These would all certainly upset the balance of a person's life. But the event does not have to be a negative one, not at all. Someone's life could be definitely upset by winning the lottery, right? Or getting married, or going on a first date that changes their life. There was an author many years ago who was very, very good at this, creating inciting incidents. You may have heard of him. His name was William Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's play, Hamlet, the inciting incident occurs in scene 4, and the first 3 scenes are very, very brief. So in scene 4, Hamlet is on the parapets up the top of the castle, and he's astounded to see the ghost of his dead father, who speaks to him. And not only does he speak to him, this ghost, but he tells Hamlet that he was actually murdered by his own brother, Claudius, who has now married Hamlet's mother, and so is his stepfather. Well, this extraordinary event utterly unbalances Hamlet's life in that very moment, and it instantly incites his desire for revenge. The actions that Hamlet takes in his quest to avenge his father's murder is what forms that story, that play. Look at the inciting incidents at the beginning of the or at least after the first few scenes that get us to care about Dorothy, in The Wizard of Oz, Frank L. Baum's novel, The Wizard of Oz, made, of course, into the iconic movie. As I say, there are first few scenes that make us really care about Dorothy and her little dog, Toto. Then the inciting incident comes on. And the inciting incident, of course, we're set up to see Dorothy, first of all, at home in Kansas on the farm with her aunt and uncle. And that's when the inciting incident happens. And the inciting incident is the tornado that carries Dorothy away to the magical land of Oz. That's the inciting incident, utterly upsetting, of course, the balance of Dorothy's life. And it incites her desire from that moment, from the moment that she arrives in the magical world of Oz, to get back home. Makes her very clear what she is and what it has incited her to want and to try to do. She takes actions constantly to try to do that. Look at the inciting incident in a much more recent story, a best-selling novel of about, I think, about 10 years ago, made into a movie called Gone Girl. This noir thriller by Gillian Flynn starts with Nick Dunn waking up on the morning of his 5th wedding anniversary and discovering that his wife, Amy, has gone missing. That event upsets the balance of Nick's life, and he takes actions right away to try to regain balance. Here's another example, The Goldfinch, the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel by Donna Tartt. At the beginning of The Goldfinch, teenager Theo Decker and his mother are at an art gallery in New York City, and they're caught in an explosion that kills his mother. It's not really a spoiler because it happens right away in the first pages. It's a horrifying event, of course, for teenage Theo Decker. And in that utterly dreadful and disorienting moment that completely upsets the balance of his life, he grabs a painting off the wall. I have a feeling it's just a sort of sense that he wants to be reconnected with his mother somehow, whom he adores. And by grabbing that painting off the wall in that moment after the explosion, it's an event, it's an action that he takes that will haunt him through all the pages of this huge novel, this huge story. Try to have the inciting incident of your story happen as close to your story's opening as you can, but don't rush it. It doesn't have to be on page 1. The important thing is, I say, that we care about your main character right away, involved in some kind of action, just like Kathy Scarlett was, or Dorothy at home and on the farm. And then when the time is ripe, bring in your inciting incident. As I say, it really should happen sometime within the first, hopefully 20, I think at a stretch, 30 pages, bringing on your inciting incident. If you write a powerful inciting incident, then it must follow as the night the day, that your character will lead you headlong into their conflict, into their world, and into a very compelling story. So that's the first essential element that agents and publishers want to see in your first 30 pages, a clear inciting incident. The second essential element, and that really needs to be in your first 30 pages, is all about your main character. Their struggle drives your narrative. So your goal is to create a main character, as I say, that the reader will care about. How do you accomplish that? How do you create an engaging hero or heroine, a person who causes the events of a stirring story? I believe it all boils down to just one word: empathy. Empathy is what is at the core of this. It's about creating an emotional response in the reader, because emotion is how we understand things deeply, how we remember things. It's how our brains work. We don't really remember abstractions very well. We remember something because we felt it. I think that actually we humans are not thinking creatures who can feel. We are feeling creatures who can think sometimes, and often not very well. Anyway, the most important characteristic of your protagonist, therefore, is that they elicit the reader's empathy. They don't necessarily have to elicit our sympathy. What's the difference? Well, Sympathy means I feel for you, but empathy means I feel with you. I identify, I understand. Sympathetic can also mean likable, but empathetic means like me. It means that deep down in that person, even an unlikable character, the reader recognizes a core of shared humanity. So it's not necessarily about being likable. We empathize for very, very personal reasons. A really good example of this is from a blockbuster novel several decades ago, made into an iconic film, The Godfather. The iconic first film, and then its spin-offs too, its sequels. Don Corleone is the Godfather in this novel and in the movie, of course. He's a mafia boss in the movie, and he is not what you would call a nice person. He, as a mafia boss, he bribes judges and he buys politicians. He has people murdered, and yet we care about him. Why? How does author Mario Puzo in the novel accomplish that? How does he make us care? It is because this author very skillfully shows Don Corleone to us in a way that will make us care. At the book's very beginning, we see him as a devoted and loving family man. He's a father to whom family is paramount. And so we instinctively warm to that. We can identify with that. Second, Puzo shows us that Don Corleone uses violence only when he is pushed to do that, after he's been hurt first. And we instinctively forgive him for that. We can, as I say, identify, hurt me and I'll strike back too. And third, we never see Don Corleone hurting anyone. He does all of his dark deeds off stage. And so although we know as readers intellectually that he uses violence and terrible violence, we don't actually see it. And so we don't feel it. Whereas we are shown very graphically the violence that the Don's enemies do to him and his family, the people he loves, like when his son Sonny, is gunned down. That we see in gory, graphic detail. And so we feel the Don's pain and his grief. We empathize. Another really fine example of a character who is not especially likable, but who definitely elicits our empathy is Scarlett O'Hara, the heroine of Margaret Mitchell's big Civil War saga, Gone with the Wind. This book has now lost favor because of its underlying racism. And I think that's an important and a very necessary social development. But nevertheless, a study of the artistic creation of its heroine by Margaret Mitchell can still inspire us as writers, just on a purely technical level. When Gone with the Wind opens, Scarlett is a vain and spoiled, selfish girl. I think she's about 16 years old. But she is someone that the reader comes to care deeply about. So how does Margaret Mitchell, the author, accomplish that? Partly it's because we get to see Scarlett's passion so deeply. Even if we don't approve of her, we understand her. We get her being in love almost to the point of obsession because, well, most of us have been in love. But right from the start, our empathy for Scarlett begins because other people, truly good people, feel real affection for Scarlett. Mammy likes her, Scarlett's father loves her, and so does her saintly mother. Even Melanie has warm feelings for Scarlett. And so the reader feels a sort of a natural human response that if these other good people like this girl, there must be something about her. But perhaps the most important thing is that we feel along with Scarlett because she is such a forceful, willful person. There's not a moment in this great big saga when Scarlett is passive. Scarlett inevitably takes action. Eventually, we get to know Scarlett almost as well as ourselves, and that creates the greatest empathy. But long before that, even when she is utterly selfish and scheming, we can't help admiring her because she's just so incredibly determined. There are some ways that you can create instant empathy for your main character. Let me tell you about 5 ways that you can create instant empathy for your main character. First, make her good at her job. You know, whether she's a music teacher or a spy, a Renaissance painter, a criminal lawyer, an astronaut, whatever. We all admire a person who just does their job well. The second way you can create instant empathy is to give him a sense of humor. I don't mean he's a stand-up comic or even that he's making wisecracks all the time. I mean just that he's someone who can smile about life. We all warm to such people. Third way third technique that you might use to create instant empathy is to make her the victim of undeserved misfortune. You know, she's fired in a corporate cutback, or ridiculed for her appearance, or loses a loved one. Ridiculed for her appearance. Remember Stephen King's novel, Carrie? Carrie was ridiculed at school, and she responded in an unforgettably scary way. The fourth way that you might create instant empathy for your main character is to put him in physical jeopardy. You want to be careful about this because you don't want him to be a passive victim. We may feel sorry for him, but to really engage us and to make us feel empathy, he's going to have to take action to get himself out of jeopardy. And number 5, and the 5th technique you might use to create instant empathy is to just give her everyday foibles and flaws. She forgets people's names. She gives webinars where she can't figure out the buttons to use to share her screen. She trips on the same step every time, whatever. Giving her everyday foibles and flaws will humanize your character. The third essential element that needs to be in your first 30 pages is a use of effective dynamic dialogue. Dialogue in a novel has a kind of magic because in a novel, dialogue is the only instance where there is no barrier between the reader and the character. There's no interference from the author giving descriptions and explanations. There's just the character expressing their unique voice, kind of exposing themselves by their words. That's why readers respond intensely to dialogue. It feels alive. And that's why agents and publishers do too. They're just people. There are several dramatic functions of dialogue, and I'm going to give you just 3 of the most important. The first dramatic function of dialogue is to move the story forward. There are countless ways that dialogue does this. A character might reveal information, or they might admit something. They might incite another character to take action. They might make accusations, or they might lie, or defend themselves, or argue their reasons. They might distract their listener. You know, the possibilities, of course, are endless. The point is that all stories are about conflict. And remember, by conflict, I don't mean combat. Conflict does not mean combat, doesn't mean fighting. It just means problems. What problems does your main character face in trying to get whatever it is they want? So good dialogue will always add some degree of tension, whether minimal or moderate or extreme, depending on the scene. The second important dramatic function of dialogue is to establish relationships. People speak differently to different people. For example, if you were going to tell your 13-year-old niece about something that you learned today from this webinar, you would use words very different from than if you were telling a fellow writer, wouldn't you? Relationships take on a unique life through dialogue. And knowing this, you can use passages of dialogue strategically to highlight the characters' relationships. The third important function of dialogue is to illuminate a character's individuality. And this is lots of fun for us as writers. The goal here is to, of course, create dialogue that is what we call character specific, pretty self-explanatory. That is, each character speaks in their own unique way. The vocabulary a person uses, the syntax of their speech, their grammar, all of it reveals a great deal about them. For example, the pedantic speech of an English professor is totally unlike the jargon of a kid living on the streets. I mean, look at just the different ways that people might say, might express just simple agreement. Someone might simply say, yes. Another might say, cool, or whatever, or you got that right, or splendid notion. These are all just declarations of agreement. And I'm sure you can think of many, many more, but each one reveals something about the character. It's also effective to pepper a character's dialogue with idioms to individualize them, words or phrases that are peculiar to that person alone. In John Irving's novel, The Cider House Rules, Dr. Larch has a favorite phrase. He runs an orphanage for boys in New England, and he has a favorite phrase that he often repeats to these orphan boys that he looks after. He says, "You kings of New England, you princes of Maine." Dr. Larch loves saying it, and the reader loves hearing it. Another example is from the novel The Princess Bride by William Goldman, and both of those novels, The Cider House Rules and The Princess Bride, were made into much loved movies. In The Princess Bride, the character in the movie, who's played by Wallace Shawn, is always saying, "It's inconceivable." He has a bit of a lisp, so he's always saying, "It's inconceivable." He says it so often that another character finally says, "I do not think you understand the meaning of that word." One more note about writing dialogue is body language. Body language is a living part of dialogue. By punctuating a sequence of dialogue with a character's body language, you can reveal some of their feelings. For example, a woman fidgets with her wedding ring rather than speaking. A man rakes his hand through his hair while he's thinking of how he might respond. A girl covers her mouth to hide a smile. These sorts of bits of body language also give rhythm to a scene, filling the silences between the characters' spoken lines. And that really fine-tunes the scene's pacing. So those are the three crucial elements that need to be in your manuscript first 30 pages to intrigue agents and publishers. Just do a quick review of what those are. First of all, you want to establish your story's inciting incident, make it very clear what it is that unbalances your main character's life and therefore incites them to take action. Number two, ensure that we care about your main character. And number three, enliven and enrich the action with dialogue. I encourage you to have a look at my website, which is justbarbarakyle.com. You'll find some free resources there, including my YouTube channel, just called Write Your Page Turner. And also on my website, you can see the information about my private mentoring that I offer, if that appeals to you. That is the end of my talk today. I'm going to just see if there are any questions. I think there are some questions here, so let me pull those up. I'm seeing a lot of you responding to not seeing the screen share. I'm so sorry about screwing that up, but I hope you at least heard my remarks, which is the most important thing. Lots of you were saying, yeah, I can't see the screen share. Hearing you just fine, though, Pamela says. Thanks for letting me know that, Pamela. Ingrid is asking, aside from too much background, what are other big mistakes that people make in the first 30 pages? Yeah, background, which is backstory. So often we writers, because we do have to create a backstory for our characters, it's very important that we know about their lives and what brought them to the moment of the inciting incident happening in their life. sometimes it's hard to let that go because we've worked so hard on it. But it's really not the place, as I say, for putting it at the beginning. What you want to do is weave that backstory throughout your narrative. I remember a screenwriter talking about this once and saying, I thought it was great advice, saying, don't answer a question until the reader has asked it. In the case of screenwriters, of course, it's a viewer. But for us as novelists, don't answer a question about your characters until the reader has asked it, sort of almost subconsciously. So let readers get to see your character in action and then bring on the backstory. So I think that that's pretty much what we're talking about, Ingrid. Other big mistakes you're asking that people make in the first 30 pages? As I said, too much description can sort of grind a story that's getting started to a halt. So description is best, again, once we kind of are seeing the character in action and we start to care about them. What are they up to? Why are they doing that? So I think that pretty much is the answer to your question. Just looking through other questions here. Do writers always write, this is Stella asking, do writers always write the structure of the whole books or some plots first? Good question, Stella. It's a question I think about planning out the novel, right? Writers work very, very differently. Some writers do not do any kind of outlining for their novels. I am a big proponent, a big cheerleader of doing an outline. In fact, in my book, which is just called Page Turner, have a look at my book, you'll see that I have a whole chapter about outlining. I call it storylining because I think it's so important that we always remember that we're telling a story. I think it's extremely important. And the reason it's so important is that it saves you, the writer, an awful lot of time and grief. Sometimes we can spend, people who are coming to a first novel, especially, they will spend, sometimes a whole year writing their first draft, and then they will realize that it needs a whole lot of work and they have to start from the beginning, get rid of a lot of dead wood, and that can be really demoralizing. And so I think it's extremely helpful for us as writers to take the time to write an outline. I call it a storyline. And as I say in my book, Page Turner, I give a lot of information about how to tackle it and how it can really, really help you. However, Stella, to answer your question, a lot of writers do not do it. I think Stephen King is pretty famous for saying that he does not write an outline. I think he probably works everything out in his head. Most of us cannot do that. It's really hard to hold a whole novel in your head. So an outline, a storyline can be so helpful. And as I say, I think save you a lot of grief. Christina says, the slides were not missed. The talk was great. Thank you very much. Catherine is asking, if you have secondary characters, how do you keep them from becoming too prominent? If you have secondary characters, well, all of us as writers in our novels do have secondary characters. Great, Catherine, and I hope you have some very intriguing ones. They should be very, very prominent. Most prominent, of course, will be the person, or in sci-fi, some kind of other kind of character. Sometimes in it can be a monster, that type of thing, non-human. But in any case, in most of our novels, it would be a person who is the antagonist. If we look at the main characters being a protagonist of your story, then the most important other character, secondary character, is your antagonist, almost always a human being. And that's someone that the main character comes up against in trying to achieve what they want. If we go all the way back to Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, he is trying to avenge his father's death, and the antagonist in that story is Claudius, his stepfather. In every compelling story, there will be some form of conflict, some character who has an agenda that is just completely at odds with your main character's agenda. Often, reviewers, non-writers will refer to this character, the antagonist, as a villain. I consider that very unhelpful for us as writers. because you need to understand what drives your antagonist. They can seem villainous and they will feel villainous perhaps to the reader, but you as the author need to understand what drives them and what brings them into conflict with your main character. So to answer your question, the most important secondary character will be the antagonist of your story, the source of conflict for your main character, but also you're going to have lots of other secondary characters, and I hope you make them all fascinating. The more you can do so, the better. Just want to check my time here. Really gone over time, partly because I was spending so long trying to find my slides. So I'll just answer one more question and then I'll say goodbye to you. Thomas is asking, if the inciting incident happens when a main character changes jobs, how can the reasons show up inside the first chapter? If the inciting incident happens when a main character changes jobs, that's fine. How can the reasons show up inside the first chapter? No, not, sorry, perhaps I didn't make that clear, Thomas. Does not have to be in the first chapter at all. You want your inciting incident just to be somewhere within the first 30 pages of your book. Sometimes a first chapter will be 5 pages, 10 pages, whatever. So don't think that you have to force it into a short first chapter. The beginning of any novel just needs to make us care about your characters and then bring on the inciting incident. In this case, would be the character changing jobs, right? So don't confuse a first chapter with what I'm talking about here, the first kind of 30 pages of a manuscript. The inciting incident needs to be probably within the first 30 pages, but that does not have to be a first chapter. And because we really are over time, I'm going to say goodbye to you now. If you have any more questions, feel free to email me. I will try to answer them. And also, you will be getting an email tomorrow with the link to the video of this. I have recorded it, and you'll get a link sent from Zoom so that you can review it if you want and hear my comments again. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope it's been helpful to you. Have a look at my website, barbarakyle.com, for some free resources and for some information about my private mentoring. And I wish you all the best with your writing. So write on. Happy writing. I'll say goodbye to you now.